Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural Lorne Crainer Memorial Lecture, hosted by the International Republican Institute in memory of a remarkable man, Lorne Crainer. We're going to hear a lot about his career this morning. I'm Senator Dan Sullivan. I have the honor of being the chairman of IRI, and I want to thank all of the attendees, Dan Twining, Peter Madigan, one of our board members, some of the Crainer family, and my good friend, Ambassador Bob Zoellick. Lorne Crainer was president of IRI from 1995 through 2001, and again from 2004 through 2014, after serving as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Lorne dedicated his life to the pursuit of liberty and the fight for human rights around the world. He embodied the vision that all people everywhere deserve the dignity that comes from political freedom. He was a pioneer in the democracy business, and his lifelong commitment to values-based, principled American leadership in the world helped millions enjoy the blessings of liberty. Today, we are celebrating Lorne's legacy by continuing his life's work through the inaugural Lorne Crainer Memorial Lecture that we will be doing every year. This lecture series will host annual conversations that exemplify Lorne's lifelong commitment to American leadership, effective diplomacy, and seeks to pass these values on to the next generation. Lorne dedicated his long and distinguished career to uplifting the hopes and aspirations of people around the world, and he especially enjoyed mentoring the next generation. To ensure his work and legacy continues, IRI has created the Lorne Crainer Memorial Fellowship Fund to support emergency democracy leaders who will continue Lorne's lifelong fight for a more free, peaceful, and democratic world. Lorne meant much to the democracy community. He was a steadfast champion for human rights and democracy, but nothing was more important to him than his family. Lorne's children, Isabel, Ricky, Charles, and his wife, Ann, meant the world to him. And to those turning in today, thank you for your commitment to the cause of political freedom. And thank you to the inaugural Lorne Crainer Memorial Lecture speaker, the Honorable Robert D. Zoellick. Now, I want to say a quick word about Ambassador Zoellick, a longtime friend of mine, a mentor of mine for decades. It's incredible how small the world is. I was an intern for Bob Zoellick when he was Undersecretary of State in 1992. So we go way back when I worked at the National Security Council staff under Condoleezza Rice. I did the international econ and trade portfolio, so I had the opportunity to travel with Bob Zoellick all over the world when he was US Trade Rep. I think sometimes he wasn't sure he wanted the NSC minder on his trips with him, but I learned so much from Ambassador Zoellick and enjoyed many morning runs in DC and other places where he and I were working together. I'm enjoying reading his book right now and recommend it to everybody, America and the world, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And his remarks today will highlight not only Lorne's great work, but pull from many of the insights in this excellent book. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. I know it will be a fantastic session with Ambassador Zoellick, full of insights. And I'm pleased now to welcome Ann Crainer, who will say a few words on behalf of Lorne's family. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, albeit virtually, to this first Crainer Memorial Lecture. A special thank you to Bob Zoellick. Bob, Lorne so respected you. Thank you to IRI Chairman Dan Sullivan for that wonderful introduction, and to Dan Twining and all who worked behind the scenes to organize this wonderful event at IRI. Many kind words have been said about Lorne's steely determination and deep sense of compassion that made him a pioneer in democracy assistance. All here know how Lorne devoted his professional life to building freedom around the world. The message we should all take from Lorne is his belief that the actions of each person are important and could make a lasting difference. He was so proud of IRI and had a deep belief in the work of IRI, NDI, and the rest of the institutes within the NED family. Lorne's steadfast belief in freedom allowed millions around the world to enjoy democracy, human rights, rule of law, and self-governance. His fight for democracy around the world was lifelong, and its victories were hard-won, but always immensely satisfying. He was ever the optimist, generous, and willing to give all of himself to the most noble of pursuits, that of freedom around the world. As most of you know, few things made him happier than seeing democracy triumph and flourish. Thank you for your belief in the cause of democracy and all your hard work towards the goal of human rights and democracy for all. It is now my great pleasure to introduce a very, very dear friend of Lorne's, my children and I, IRI board member, Peter Madigan.
Thank you very much, Anne, and good morning. We all hope that this series will bring you and Isabel, Charlie, and Ricky comfort in the coming years by reminding you how much your husband was beloved in our community. Good morning, I'm Peter Madigan, a member of the IRI board. I've worked with Lorne for over 30 years. He's my close friend, and I miss him every day. I can't think of a better program for kicking this off than the one we have for you today. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. We will be taking questions during the last 10 minutes of the program. Those who wish to submit a question for consideration, please send via private message to the account marked Q&A below. This discussion will be recorded and broadcast via Facebook Live. We will not be taking questions via Facebook, and there will be a quiz after the program, so take notes. Kidding. Our first speaker for the inaugural Lorne Crainer Memorial Lecture is the Honorable Robert Bruce Zoellick. Bob Zoellick has an incredible career in public and private service. It was great to hear Senator Sullivan talk about his time with Bob. Lorne and I also shared a lot of time with Bob. And it was when he served in senior positions at the Department of State and Treasury in the White House under Presidents Reagan and Bush 41. He served our nation, in addition, as a member of the cabinet and sub-cabinet in the administration of George W. Bush, and in particular, as Senator Sullivan mentioned, as U.S. Trade Representative and Deputy Secretary of State. And I think if Lorne was here, he would say that Bob was the best U.S. Trade Representative that the United States has had. He went on to cap his service as the president of the World Bank. Bob's now a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School, of which I might add he is a graduate. Bob recently completed his wonderful new book, America in the World. It's a long book. It's a wonderful book, a history of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy released this past August. Bob's book argues the belief that the United States is an exceptional, ongoing experiment, both home and in international relations, that should serve a larger purpose. Bob Zoellick has been my friend for 35 years. As I said, we worked together and served together at Treasury and State. Lorne Crainer joined our team in the early formation of the Baker State Department. Our alleged team worked daily with Bob. We counted on his expertise and knowledge, but we relished in his curiosity of our daily comings and goings on Capitol Hill. Bob appreciated us, and Lorne reminded me not long ago that being around Bob Zoellick was one of the best things that happened to us in government. To deliver the inaugural Lorne W. Crainer Lecture, it's my great pleasure to introduce Lorne's friend, the Honorable Robert B. Zoellick.
Well, thank you, Peter, for such a generous introduction. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to be with Anne and Isabel and Dan and both Dans, as well as you and the whole IRI community. So let me start with a few years back. On June 20th, 1782, the US Congress approved the design of the Great Seal for the new United States. Americans had taken a long time to agree on the seal, almost as long as they had to win their independence. The Congress had appointed the committee to prepare the seal almost 6 years earlier, on the 4th of July, 1776. Now, in 1782, Charles Thomson, the Secretary of the Congress, explained the symbolism of the proposed design. He pointed to the 13-tiered, yet unfinished pyramid of states overseen by the Eye of Providence. The Virgilian motto underneath, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages, suggested that the founding fathers had some big ideas in mind. Thomson observed that the date underneath the seal, 1776, marked the Declaration of Independence. And the words of the motto, according to Thomson, quote, signified the beginning of the new American era, which commences on that date. As James Field, my first professor of diplomatic history, pointed out, Thomson's explanation does not clarify whether the adjective American is to be construed as geographically limiting or as broadly descriptive. Professor Field added that much of American history is implicit in this question. Is the American era just for us at home, or will it range far and wide? For those of you who don't recall the Great Seal of the United States, but who still carry cash, you'll find that the US Treasury conveniently arranged to reproduce the seal on the back of the dollar bill. I've opened with this story because Lorne Crainer, our friend, loved US history and the adventure of America. I will return to ideas in history a little later because I think Lorne would have enjoyed discussing America's purpose in the world today. I first wish to recollect Lorne Crainer, the man. His favorite drink was tomato juice with added salt. When Lorne traveled, which was often, he hauled along a gym bag with books. He loved cars. And recall, this was during an era when people still used to drive their own cars. Lorne could walk into any room in any country, in any part of the world, and convey to the person that he met that he or she was the only one who mattered. Lorne was a natural. As Winston Churchill said about a close friend who passed away too young, Lorne seemed to have a double dose of human nature. The true north of Lorne's life was the love of his family. He adored Anne, his partner. Having lost his own father to war at an early age, Lorne reveled in being a good dad. And he wanted Isabel, Ricky, Alexander, and Charlie to be his life's work, as well as part of his work life. Lorne brought his family to IRI events, ranging from social to those at the heart of IRI's mission. Some 15 years ago, when IRI launched the Women's Democracy Network, Lorne made sure that Isabel was there to see the opening day. Lorne felt deeply that for generations, forever really, women had been excluded or marginalized from political life. And he knew that no democracy could prosper with only half its citizens. And he wanted Isabel and her brothers to know that they could be part of a new era. Lorne being Lorne, he had an extended family. He came from a line of heroes, and Lorne added to their honor through his inspiring, gallant service. He carried the Stars and Stripes forward in a distinctive way. Lorne's dad, Bob Crainer, an Air Force pilot, was shot down on his 102nd mission, 2 over the maximum for Air Force pilots. Major Crainer stood steadfast as a POW in the Hanoi Hilton. The naval aviator in solitary confinement in the next cell was named John McCain. For 2 years, they rarely saw one another, but communicated continually through 18 inches of brick. McCain later wrote that Bob Crainer kept him alive by tapping encouragement in code through the wall. And Senator McCain became a godfather of sorts to Lorne. John McCain and Lorne Crainer shared a rare gift. I recall after meetings with Senator McCain on some trying topic facing long odds, that McCain would cut through the gloom by mumbling, "I've had worse days." And then we'd all perk up and recognize that we should keep plugging away, looking towards a brighter day. With Lorne, we would hear, just at the right moment, that amazing, astonishing, and astounding laugh. The tense or frustrating moment would fade away, unable to resist Lorne's signal of unbounded friendship and belief in what could be done. I first met Lorne in early 1989 when he joined Secretary of State James Baker's team as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. Lorne had already gained valuable congressional experience with two Arizonan internationalists, Jim Colby and John McCain. Lorne paired well with his lifetime friend, the indefatigable and irreverent Peter Madigan, who came to stay with us from the Treasury Department. Peter and Lorne complemented their boss wonderfully, the, shall we say, indomitable, incomparable Janet Mullins. Secretary Baker gave them a lot to do with Congress, especially treaties for the Senate. I had the good fortune to work again with Lorne when President George W. Bush and Secretary Colin Powell appointed him Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I was working as U.S. Trade Representative. Lorne shared the idea, along with our mutual friend, the late Matt Niemeyer, that free trade and the rule of law could encourage and support open societies and the development of institutions upon which strong republics must be based. Of course, Lorne's government service led him to his greatest task and contribution, the building of the International Republican Institute as a cornerstone of the worldwide effort to promote representative government, democratic cultures, better and more transparent governance, freedom, and human rights. President Ronald Reagan planted the seed of the idea for the National Endowment of Democracy, including IRI and the National Democratic Institute, in his speech at Westminster in London on June 8, 1982. The moment was not auspicious. The early summer of 1982 seemed like a low point in the Cold War. The United States was still in a deep recession, and the world economy had grown very little over 5 years. The Western Allies debated fractiously. Communism had cracked down in Poland, and large demonstrations marched for a nuclear freeze. Reagan's speech, much of which he wrote himself and all of which he edited closely, shone a light on a different pathway, one of democracy and peace. He offered a vision, yet was also a willingness to negotiate. Reagan recognized that the not at all fragile flower of democracy still needed cultivating. He added practical steps to his principled summons so as to foster the infrastructure of democracy, a free press, unions, political parties, and universities. President Reagan turned out to be the most successful when he enlisted partners who helped him turn words into actions. Secretary of State George Shultz played such a role for Reagan's foreign policy. Secretary Baker assisted with Reagan's economic policies at home and internationally. And Lorne Crainer brought the speech at Westminster to life through the International Republican Institute. Lorne understood that democracies have to work every day of the year, not just on election days. Republics need constitutions and institutions, parties and communities, along with majorities and minorities that can debate, reconcile, and transfer authority peacefully. Citizens and their representatives need to advocate, negotiate, and even compromise. Lorne had the capacity to sense a political opening in countries. Once he perceived an opportunity, he would start a training program or an exchange, expand relationships, foster networks that would build resilience. Lorne was proud of America's democratic story, its perpetual striving to do better. And he combined America's nationalism with its internationalism. He reached out to democratic partners around the world. Lorne built a transatlantic partnership with Wilfred Martens, then the leader of the European People's Party. Lorne understood that the idea of America was understood best when people from other countries embraced the appeal in their own languages and through their own independent experiences. Wherever Lorne went, to Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, he looked for partners, fostered the local roots of their democracies, whether growing, recent, or even just potential. As John Quincy Adams, an American realist, explained almost 2 centuries ago, freedom must be grounded in a mutual commitment among equals. It cannot be gifted or grounded by an outside power. Lorne encouraged, but he also knew how to lead from the front. When Egypt's government raided and closed IRI's offices just days before an election, Lorne flew to Cairo with $10,000 in cash to carry forward the election observer mission on his own shoulders. Lorne also recognized that IRI's work was a two-way street, especially for members of Congress. IRI's missions enabled elected officials to meet their counterparts abroad, to better understand the on-the-ground challenges of political and economic development, and to recognize commonalities, but also perceived differences. Travel and common causes may help Americans of different parties to get to know one another as people, even as colleagues. Perhaps IRI and NDI can import some helpful democratic cultures and customs to help the work at home. Lorne would be the first to say that his efforts were just part of the legacies of an incredible group, from the IRI board and leadership through the intrepid staff and on to every recruited partner and intern. So they are. We will see the finest memorial for Lorne and the founding generation of IRI through the work of President Daniel Twining, today's board, and the inheritors of the tradition. Churchill offered a description that matches Lorne Crainer. He banked his treasure in the hearts of his friends, and they will cherish his memory till their time has come. I opened with some history because I thought Lorne would have enjoyed the story. I'll close with some ideas for the future, drawing from history, because I think Lorne would relish stirring debate about the future Republican foreign policy. We've been living through some divisive times as Americans and Republicans. In the words of that wise philosopher, Charlie Brown, I'm still hoping yesterday will get better. Today, I'll offer 6 principles to guide a future Republican foreign policy. First, a Republican foreign policy will respect power, being neither ashamed to pursue America's national interests, nor too quick to use the country's might. By matching America's power to its interests, U.S. foreign policy can achieve its objectives and build credibility, both at home and abroad. Alexander Hamilton, in the Republic's earliest days, recognized that America's economic strength built the sinews of American power. As for diplomacy, Hamilton cautioned, strut is good for nothing. Real firmness combines energy with moderation. Abraham Lincoln understood that the U.S. Union, if preserved, could create a new type of power, including of attractive example. Theodore Roosevelt, at the turn of the 20th century, used America's influence to mediate among great powers in Asia and Europe, seeking to maintain balances of power. TR recognized that, quote, diplomacy rests on the substantial base of potential force, but he also advised, walk softly and carry a big stick. Decades later, Dwight Eisenhower had to marshal American power carefully, building and sustaining strength and internal dynamism for the long twilight struggle with the Soviets. Second, a conservative and Republican foreign policy prudently adds to America's influence by building and sustaining alliances and coalitions. Effective coalition leadership requires disciplined assessments of priorities, listening, an appreciation of others' interests, continual consultations, and the skill of focusing on core objectives while being willing to compromise on other points. The genius of America's alliance leadership has been to mobilize support for key U.S. aims while enabling its partners to advance their interests. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, the great congressional architect of the Marshall Plan, NATO, and the U.S. role in the UN, helped guide the Truman administration towards this new model by combining alliances with U.S. national interests. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger rebalanced alliance burden sharing after the painful experience in Vietnam. Nixon's new doctrine preserved American leadership and the power of U.S. initiative under changed circumstances. The grand masters of alliance leadership, George H.W. Bush and James Baker, brought the Cold War to a peaceful end in Europe, organized a landmark coalition to reverse Saddam Hussein's aggression, and laid the foundation for economic partnerships in North America, the Asia Pacific, and globally. Their prudent yet highly competitive diplomacy fortified US power and advanced American principles. They emphasized deeds over talk. Third, Republicans should judge international agreements and institutions as means to achieve ends, not as forms of political therapy. Agreements and institutions can help recognize common interests, mobilize resources, facilitate bargaining, encourage the development of shared rules, manage differences, and resolve disputes cooperatively. RI has extended democratic ideals and practices by working with and building institutions. Yet conservatives recognize that international law, unlike domestic law, only codifies agreed upon cooperation. Even among democracies, international law not backed by enforcement needs negotiations to work. And international law not backed by power cannot cope with dangerous states and people. In the early 20th century, Republican secretaries of state and war, Charles Evans Hughes, Elihu Root, pushed for a practical American internationalism. They drew upon America's experience to expand international options for achieving US aims. In later generations, Henry Kissinger and James Baker shrewdly negotiated international agreements and organized coalitions through international bodies. They were realists, yet with a creative sense of the good that only America could achieve and the international order that the United States could design and construct. Fourth, a modern Republican foreign policy must embrace revolutionary changes in information, communications, technology, commerce, science, finance, and the environment. These transformations will shape global politics, economics, and security. Communities of private groups, whether organized for business or social causes, will achieve results far beyond the reach of governments and international bureaucracies. The United States should leverage this dynamism to open minds, markets, and societies. America should ally with agents of changes around the world through new networks of free trade, information, and investment. It's a fool's game and a loser's strategy to compete with authoritarians by restricting America's openness, whether to people, goods, capital, inventions, or ideas. Fortress America retreats to defense instead of going on offense to reshape the competition. Even in the aftermath of our terrifying Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward believed that America's economy and its ideas could be a magnet, an attractive power that contrasted with the dominating dictates of empires. Seward thought that the Union, once preserved, could offer ideas for new types of cooperative relations and even integration among states. And Seward was, of course, willing to pay $7.2 million to Russia so that Dan Sullivan could become a senator from Alaska in IRI's chair. Ronald Reagan and George Shultz shared an optimism about America's engine of free enterprise, especially in a new information age. They recognized that the Soviet Union's planned economy could never keep up with capitalism's technological innovation. Reagan also knew that America's prosperity grew with the world's. In 1979, when launching his presidential campaign, Reagan foresaw that, quote, the key to our own future security may lie in both Mexico and Canada being much stronger countries than they are today. It's time that we stop thinking of our nearest neighbors as foreigners. That sounds a little different than recent campaign rhetoric. Lorne carried the banner of Reagan's beliefs. When President George W. Bush, Jim Colby, and other innovators created the Millennium Challenge Corporation to link development assistance to better governance, open trade, and economic reforms, Lorne again stepped up to help put plans into practice. Lorne was a doer. Fifth, Republicans know from experience that there are people in the world who hate America and the ideas it upholds. The United States must remain vigilant and have the strength to defeat its enemies. People driven by enmity or a need to dominate will not respond to reason or goodwill. They will manipulate civilized rules for uncivilized ends. Abraham Lincoln, our most empathetic president, recognized that the evil of slavery had to be extirpated to preserve the last best hope of the American democratic experiment. Finally, all Republican policies, foreign and domestic, must be founded on respect for the Constitution. The Constitution, taken together with the Declaration of Independence, suggests that the national purpose is to safeguard the American people, form a more perfect union, protect constitutional rights, and enable Americans to pursue the fruits of their liberties, while furthering a wide order that respects free individuals, just governments, and the common dignity of humankind. The founding fathers were both visionary and cautionary, suggesting that governmental power should be exercised with restraint, while individual initiative should be encouraged at home and abroad. With a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, the founders would urge their inheritors to explain America's views, while never shrinking from pursuing the country's reasoned beliefs. The most cherished belief is an exceptional one, that America's greatest power is to be found in the dynamism of its citizens, and that the intrepid spirit of Americans will shape future eras at home and around the world. The Constitution is not just a revered ancient text or maxims to be cited opportunistically. Every one of you have served in government, elected or selected, took an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution. These are the responsibilities, duties, rights, and limits we inherited from patriots who came before us, and I hope will hand over to future generations of Americans. Man is spirit, Churchill told his colleagues shortly before resigning the last time. As Andrew Roberts explains at the close of his marvelous Churchill biography, the departing statesman viewed spirit as the dash, intelligence, hard work, persistence, physical and moral courage, and above all, iron willpower of a lifetime. Lorne Crainer is a spirit for all of us and for always.
Thank you, Bob. Master Zoellick, really grateful to you for sharing your insights and wisdom as an elder statesman who still has many decades ahead of him. Thank you. We've all learned a lot from you today, and I look forward to our chat. I would just like to thank Peter Madigan, who helped make all of this possible. Obviously, Senator Sullivan, our chairman, the Crainer family. It means so much to us to have you with us. It does feel like Lorne is with us here in spirit. Everybody who contributed to the Lorne Crainer Memorial Fund at IRI, which will sustain not just this activity, but a set of Crainer Fellows who will be young and hopefully shaped by their engagement with the Crainer Fellowship in the same way that I was shaped by my engagement with Lorne Crainer in my first internship when I was 19 years old at a place called the International Republican Institute. So again, with great support from Peter Madigan and so many of you, we thought that really one of the best ways to honor Lorne's memory was first to get the wisdom of patriots and internationalists like Bob Zoellick and others to really build out on the worldview that Lorne shared, and equally to invest in the next generation, because Lorne was always so terrific about supporting young people and motivating them to engage on democracy and human rights. So Bob, your book is magnificent. It's really an extraordinary rendition of the story of America in the world. And I really, really like the way that you draw a line. You really weave a thread through the very earliest diplomacy of the American Republic to today, in terms of what has actually been really one fundamental American foreign policy doctrine, which is around both principle and pragmatism, that American diplomacy has been motivated very much by principle. Small r Republican values, a world in which there are more democracies for us to work with, and a very focused effort on not importing the aristocratic, monarchic, tyrannical tendencies of the old world into the new, but to build a new and better world in the Western Hemisphere, and then really to project that out. And I'm really struck by your insights into this, again, this American diplomatic unique convergence of principle and pragmatism, really with a focus on optimism and progress, that there is something optimistic about the American approach to the world. So could we just draw you out on that a little more, looking at the last 200 years?
Well, I have to start, Daniel, by saying, well, I'm as you described it, elder statesman. I really didn't know all these people. They do date back a little further than my time period. And compared to Senator Dan Sullivan's colleagues, I'm sort of in the junior league here. This is, look, the one of the reasons that I wrote the book, and perhaps it even has some application today, is that when I was in government, I found that I often drew on history as I thought about policy issues. And I wanted to suggest to a younger generation that this could perhaps be of help to them as they think about problem solving. As you know, Daniel, for many people now who study foreign policy, it has a heavy dose of international relations theory. And it's all intellectually interesting to play around with. But to be honest, when I dealt with German unification or genocide in Darfur or trade or World Bank issues, didn't seem too directly applicable. So what I tried to do in the book was to focus on stories of how people in particular areas tried to solve the problems of their time. And in doing so, I tried to recognize that, in some ways, it's okay if in a world, an imperfect world, to have solutions that advance, but of course may not solve everybody's problem at all times. It's a way to look at history, not kind of as a sense of bondage of difficulties for forever, but kind of to draw lessons to try to do better. And I think that's a lot of what I've tried to work in here for the IRI story. To understand the history of RI, where it came from, President Reagan, what he was trying to do at the time. But at the same aspect, to understand that part of that origin was not only to sponsor the values and principles of democracy, but he was willing to negotiate. And that's where George Shultz played a very, very key role. So I tried to, in both the book and in my comments even today, recognize that sometimes people who feel strongly can talk about subjects, but at the end of the day, you have to do things, you have to accomplish things. That certainly was the approach of Baker, is the approach of Lorne Crainer. That's what he kind of lived his life to do. And I'll just add this point, that when what I've been encouraged by some universities, some professors that have started to use the book, have found that perhaps after decades of critical studies professors where everything is gloom, some of the students seem to like the book, where you can actually figure out people can try to accomplish things, and you learn from their mistakes. And so in a way, it's a wonderful way of tying in IRI, Lorne Crainer's sort of role as sort of a founder of IRI, but also for all of those in the Republican Party to look ahead. We face a big debate here. And obviously some of the themes that I talked about today would not be the themes that we've been pursuing recently. And I believe we should argue about those, because I think that if the United States withdraws, or the United States doesn't work well with allies, or the United States turns protectionist, or the United States turns against ideas about openness and ideas in immigration, I don't think that will help us or the world. So that's something that we as Republicans should also do.
Thank you. And just for our audience, we're going to do about 10 minutes of discussion here, and then we'll take some questions from the floor. So please do pop your questions into the Q&A chat function, and we will take them in about 10 minutes. So Bob, I'm so tempted just to talk about, the early diplomacy of Alexander Hamilton, et cetera. But since you do, of course, want us to be both pragmatic and future oriented, I do want to just draw you out a little bit on how you see our relationship with China. It does seem like, as you suggest, we have extraordinary legacy advantages around alliances, around the fact that our greatest partners in the world are fellow market democracies, many of the most capable and prosperous market democracies, around our long tradition of economic statecraft as well as global diplomatic engagement. But of course, this relationship with China does feel like it's at a pivot point. And we'd love to hear from you on what you see as the way ahead. This is, of course, one of the great debates in American foreign policy today.
So for China, of all sort of challenges, but it's true for everything in American foreign policy, we have to start at home. I mean, so not only the type of society we want to have, how we stand should stand as a beacon to the world, our economic and technological advances. Like you, Daniel, I spend a lot of time talking with people abroad, and I always sort of point out, you have to understand, America washes its dirty linen in public, unlike authoritarian systems. So some of this debate is part of a healthy process, but it's up to all of us to decide where it goes. Then second, as I alluded to, I think sometimes when authoritarians take actions to shut things down, we've seen a temptation in American history that then, oh, well, we're going to shut things down. I think that's a big mistake. I don't think we can outcompete authoritarians or the Chinese by closing off our universities, by cutting off our trade, by trying to sort of become a fortress. It won't work. I mean, and it's not our strength. So we need to recognize that. So at the same time that we want to focus on, appropriate security issues, I think it's terrible that we discourage young people from all over the world to come to our universities. And there'll be spies, some of them you have to watch, but in my experience, and I'm sure it's been yours, Daniel, and I know it was Lauren's, the people who come to the United States see the country as a whole, and 90% of them come back with a very positive view about it. Third, again, as I alluded to with these principles, America is most effective when we work with alliances and coalitions. And sometimes this gets frustrating. Countries have their own different perspectives. Germany and France will have a different view on China today. Countries in Asia will not take the approach of just trying to contain China. Anybody who deals with Asian economies will recognize that. And so part of the effectiveness of being alliance and a coalition leader is keeping your eye on the ball, the main things that you want to try to accomplish, but also pulling others together. And frankly, for Republicans, I think this will be a challenge really to press the Biden administration on the trade issue. They want to be multilateral. They want to be alliance. I encourage that. I wish them the best. I think if they let protectionist constituencies pull them back on trade or digital trade or other issues, we'll fall behind. And again, anybody that understands Asia today, the European Union, knows those are sort of key elements. Then on top of that, on the broader human rights issue, I do think there's a challenge here for Republicans. And that is, Reagan had a wonderful ability to press these issues in an aspirational way. He was always trying to convert the Soviets. He wasn't trying to just club them. And when we use ideas of freedom and human rights in a way that looks like they're just there to insult people, I don't think they're going to be constructive. And so I think, again, one of the strengths of IRI and things that Lauren worked on, or frankly, that I tried to work on, or we're trying to kind of keep the pressure on societies. And so even take Hong Kong today. I admire what the British have done in sort of opening up for millions of people from Hong Kong to come to Britain. Why don't we do that? That's the best way to show the difference in these societies. Instead, we sanction everybody we can see, and there's limits to trying to do that. And then also, we need to realize if the attitude towards China becomes solely one of confrontation and sort of zero sum or lose or decoupling, the world's going to become a much less safe place. There's a lot of, one of the sad things about the debate about China is that there's this new view that cooperation with China failed. That's just historically totally faulty. If you look at whether economic issues, proliferation issues, cooperation with the UN, it doesn't mean that all is fine. It actually means you need to build your coalitions to press the Chinese on some of these topics, which I think the United States can do. So to be honest, when I hear some of the rhetoric, Daniel, I get a little worried that it's almost we lose confidence in ourselves. And I don't think that's at all appropriate as a society. And again, on the human rights topics, I remember one of the first trips I took with President Bush 41, so this is early 1989, was after Emperor Hirohito's death. We went to China. And I remember President Bush went to the small Christian church that he had attended when he had been the representative. That was a good way of sending a signal. And so I think one of the things I urge for the democracy and human rights community is we should stand for our principles, we should make our case, but we should try to do it in a way that suggests there's a better tomorrow for others, as opposed to trying to cast them out instead of act like, well, as long as there's a communist party in China, we can't deal with it, which was the heart of some of our past rhetoric. The days of China, the transformation of China, these areas have not yet passed, and we should be standing for things we believe in while also working cooperatively with allies and where we can with China. And the last, if you're going to deal with issues like climate or biological security, like vaccinations or economics, you can't ignore China. So that's where the practical side of Republican foreign policy needs to fit in.
Absolutely, well said. I'm just going to ask one more quick question because we have some really good ones coming in from our audience. But I do want to go back to Reagan and the Westminster speech and just his outlook in 1982. As you point out in your excellent book, the world actually was quite a grim place in 1982. US alliances were troubled. The US economy was in very bad shape, so Americans were not confident after what we had experienced later in the 70s. It does feel useful to remind people of what happened over the decade between 1982 and 1991. So can you draw a line for us in how Reagan and President Bush, 41, who you worked for, to a certain extent feels similarly dyspeptic today in a certain respect. The world is tough, it's messy. America is divided and not at complete ease, not unified. But what was it that Reagan and Bush brought that was so game-changing to our position in the world?
Well, Daniel, you probably know this famous line from Mark Twain, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Well, there are certainly ideas. I think one has to be careful with direct analogies, but the chapter on Reagan was quite a challenge because what I found is that it's still hard for scholars, certainly for many people abroad, to understand what Ronald Reagan brought to it. And I focused on his speech writing. Willin Bowden, who some of you may know at the University of Texas, who's writing a biography on Reagan, thought it was maybe the best single chapter on the Reagan's foreign policy. Because one had to understand, Reagan was an autodidact. He was a self-taught man. And he learned through his writing. Richard Darman, who I knew early in my life, passed away sadly years ago, who was the staff secretary, said, people often refer to Reagan as the great communicator. In fact, he's a great editor. And there's been a number of books that come out that show his writings when he was doing radio events, every week and so on and so forth. He used those sort of efforts to form his thinking. It was more of an instinctive thought than it was sort of traditional deductive calculations. And he learned his way to express himself extremely effectively on these issues. And so you can see in much of his presidency the role that he used speeches to frame these ideas. And the Westminster speech, which at the time was actually panned and seen as kind of old, this really does define his approach to the Cold War. But, and this is an important but, what you also see is that Reagan at heart was also a practical person and a negotiator, but it depended on who was around him. George Shultz comes in, plays a very critical role in getting Reagan to engage with the Soviet Union, which Nancy Reagan also, by the way, supported. For those of us that worked with Baker, Baker did this obviously in the first term on domestic economics. He did it in international economics sort of in the second term. And in a different way, it's part of Lorne Crainer's story. Lorne Crainer helped bring the IRI to life. So that's an important thing to understand about what Reagan sort of brought. Reagan also had an optimism. He had a belief in the things I set forward, these principles, America's technological capacity, its openness, its strength of a society. Goodness knows, as I said, he embraced North America in ways that certainly sound a little different from what we've heard the past 4 years. And then for Bush 41, very different man. and obviously in some ways was uncomfortable with Reagan's communication style. Bush 41 was one of the things people have a hard time understanding about him, because he was very prudent and a gentleman. They didn't fully recognize how competitive he was. But if you look at his actions, and this is where he fitted with Baker, these guys were always there to win, and they were there to get things done. And that's where I think as historians look at the two, they'll realize that particularly the relationship between those two becomes critical. Because as Peter knows and others who work, Baker was always the action. We were always there to sort of move the agenda ahead and try to anticipate where we could, whether it was NAFTA, German unification, Gulf War coalition, a whole set of things. And I think that's also important because, to be honest, some of Republican foreign policy in recent years has been long on talk, and even it's interesting, some of the accounts have come out, people say, oh, I wrote this NSC memo and really outlined the strategy, but we didn't do it. Well, in my book, you can write lots of memos. It depends on what you do.
Great. All right. Here's a great question from Larry, and this is for sort of the younger generation. The question is for students interested in diplomacy-related careers and committed to the values of the American experiment. What's your advice for their preparation and entry into diplomacy as a vocation? So, Bob, what career advice would you give young people who want to end up a bit like you?
Madigan would call this the ultimate softball, because the start is, of course, read my book, and you'll learn a lot about the people and the problem solving. But beyond that, this is going to sound like an unusual one for young people, but it's something I've observed over the years. Pick your boss. You probably think your boss picks you, which of course they do, but your own experience shows this, Daniel, is that it's the people you can learn from. And you may not like everything about it. You may not admire every sort of personal quality, but that's a key aspect of kind of how you develop professionally and personally. And of course, some of this is analytical ability, some of it's interpersonal style, some of it's peripheral vision of different issues. And then based on that, what I discovered is if you try to put yourself in the shoes of your boss and say, what does your boss really need? Not so much what you think they need, but what do they sort of need? You're more likely to start to think like a decision maker, more likely to become a decision maker, and you're certainly more likely to be helpful in terms of things. So that's another perspective to try to bring to the process. But you have Senator Sullivan here. He's gone through a number of these sort of transformations until, sad to say, he ended up in the legislative branch as opposed to the executive branch. But, who knows? It's a good place to be for now. But so these are kind of the lessons that I think, the other part, I guess, for young people these days, particularly of a conservative or Republican bent, is there's a lot of gloom out there. And because of my book, I've talked to a lot of university audiences. The opportunities are enormous from what I see in terms of technology, open society. There's always problems. There will be problems. But for goodness sakes, get committed to try to see what you can achieve, first in a modest way, but then sort of over time.
Fully agree. Thank you. It's a great rallying cry. Okay, Ferdous Intaj asks, and I'm just going to summarize here. You point out President Reagan really valued the relationships with Canada and Mexico. Obviously, most American leaders have understood the importance of friendship and alliance in North America. How should we approach South America? I was really struck by your chapter on John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay and the support for the American system, that America in the 1820s and 1830s was determined to support democratic republics in Latin America and keep European colonialists out. So what should be the answer in the 21st century looking south?
Well, the starting point is we still have a lot to do in the nearby region. I mean, so just a word further, Mexico under President Lopez Obrador, in my view, it's sad. It's actually kind of taking apart some of the institutions that have been developed over 25 or 30 years. One of the stories about NAFTA that was interesting to me was that for all of President Trump's attacks on it and Lopez Obrador's dislike of it, it had embedded itself enough that they couldn't get rid of it. They sort of had to try to modify it at the side. But what NAFTA was about was much more than trade. It was helping to build institutions. And you could see the economic institutions develop at the Bank of Mexico and Treasury and others. It didn't extend as enough to the social sector. So one small point for Senator Sullivan and his colleagues is that as you implement the USMCA, there are these labor provisions. they could either be used to be very protectionist or to help build the labor unions in a positive way. So these are where the devil's in the details. Then the step beyond is that, you know, the Bush Center, the Bush 43 Center, just came out with an interesting report trying to build on something I tried to do a while ago, which is why not connect the Central American Trade Agreement with NAFTA? So why, if we're really concerned about the problems of governance and security in Central America, it's partly a development story, it's partly a security story. We can't do that all by ourselves. We need the kind of help of others. Then for the rest of Latin America, I think you kind of build on these same principles. You know, frankly, one of the reasons that, you know, Peter Madigan and I and others pushed the various free trade agreements we did was that at some point, we now have them with Central America, Mexico, Canada, Dominican Republic, Chile, Peru, Colombia. You know, at some point you could start to perhaps connect these with a group. And you need to offer some optimism for people in the region. Now, trade alone isn't enough, but you could connect this with your development strategy, your open society strategy. And so, you know, because of the commodity market basis of a lot of Latin American economies, this will often move with cycles. And you can, but you know, you're going to see a upswing in the copper cycle, maybe some in the agriculture cycle. And then it goes in some ways to the bread and butter work of IRI with governance. And here I'm not just talking about democracies, I'm talking about institutions and judiciaries and dealing with corruption, which has been a real sort of problem for public support in Latin America. This is hard work. And it's one difference in the book. I talk about Henry Clay versus John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was not a realist who only saw in power terms. He had a tremendous commitment to values and republicanism, small r republicanism. But he just didn't feel that other countries were ready for it, even in Europe. Now, it turned out he was wrong historically, but he was right in the sense that you can't just force this on people. You have to create the context and sort of the garden where the seeds will grow. And that, I think, will be the long-term role with Latin America. And I'll just conclude with this again for Dan and his colleagues. A lot of what the Biden administration doing, I encourage it. I'm very worried that for constituency reasons, they're going to put trade on the back burner, just like President Obama did in his first 4 years. He finally turned to get TPP done in his last years. And frankly, if he'd gotten done a year earlier, Paul Ryan would have gotten it through the Congress. So I'm worried that we need to press this administration to recognize that trade and international economics has to be part of their foreign policy.
Absolutely. And obviously, we've seen in very different ways how China has made it central to its global engagement, again, in very different ways. Okay, Bob, thank you. It's been such a pleasure. I'm going to hand it back to Peter Madigan to wrap us up. Thank you.
Hey, Dan. Bob, thank you very, very much for your remarks. And I just want to say we're pleased to kick it off this way, I think, with a discussion that left us all thinking as we go forward. I do recommend people read the book. And as a college teacher right now, someone teaching classes, I've recommended it to many of my students. What I do want to say is that it's really important for everybody to know that Dan Twining and all the folks at IRI did so much to make this happen today. I want to thank Senator Dan Sullivan. Both he and I share having worked for Bob and under Bob, and he's gone on to bigger and better things, but his chairmanship of IRI has become a very important thing to the success and future in the 21st century of the International Republican Institute. I want to thank the audience as well for its questions and remind you that this event is posted on IRI's Facebook page. But please consider supporting future programs such as this one to help extend Lorne's legacy into the next generations. And that's what this is really all about. A link to the Lorne Crainer Memorial Fellowship Fund has been dropped into the chat and is on IRI's website at theiri.org. Thank you to everyone for coming. And thank you once again. God bless America and God bless everybody that joined us today.